There's something troubling that very few acknowledge, but it's happening in thousands of hearts. People who love God, who pray, who seek, who serve. Suddenly, they no longer find joy in anything. Activities that once excited them now feel empty. What once brought peace now barely stirs their souls, and while they try to feign normalcy, they silently wonder inside, what's happening to me? Why doesn't anything fulfill me? The most unsettling thing is that many interpret this state as a sign of spiritual decline, when in reality it could be the deepest evidence that God is beginning a work that will transform their lives from the ground up. That's why I need you to stay until the end of this video, because there I will reveal the spiritual key that almost no one understands, and that can free your heart from a guilt that never belonged to you. When joy fades for no apparent reason, the soul enters a sacred territory designed by God Himself. It's not an accident, it's a process. It's as if heaven begins to strip you of all the distractions that kept you emotionally occupied, leading you to a level of faith where you no longer depend on human sensations, but on a presence that is unseen yet sustaining. This emptiness you feel is not a punishment, it's a transition, a spiritual surgery where God is touching fibers you previously kept hidden. And although this stage feels like walking with a lamp without light, it is precisely on this dark path that your spirit will begin to hear God more clearly than ever before. Because true joy is not born in comfort, but in the silence where the soul surrenders and discovers it has been called to a depth few dare to face. And just when the night seems to grow denser, a divine whisper awakens within you, as a sign that something eternal is beginning to take shape. That whisper that began to awaken within you doesn't appear by chance. It arises precisely when you feel you have nothing left to cling to. When emotions subside and old supports no longer work, the soul is exposed, vulnerable, almost naked before God. And that's where the true process begins, when you can no longer take refuge in what once gave you temporary comfort. Most people fear this state because it seems like a loss. But spiritually, it's a birth. God doesn't extinguish your joys to leave you empty, but to show you that you are clinging to things too weak to bear the weight of your soul. That's why, when the inner noise dies down, the Spirit can finally speak with a clarity that was previously buried under layers of fleeting emotions. Many believe this emotional silence is a sign that something is wrong, but it's actually an invitation. An invitation to discover that faith isn't about feeling, but about remaining. This is the place where God teaches you to walk without depending on spiritual euphoria, religious fervor, or the sensations that once fueled your emotions. Here, in this dry land, He is strengthening your roots so that you may grow deeper than ever before. And though it may not seem so, it is in this apparent desert that the heart begins to recognize the voice it had always ignored due to the excess of stimuli. Because when God decides to shape your spirit, He first removes everything that could compete with His presence. It is in this silent purification that something within you begins to understand that true joy is not a feeling, but a source that is activated when nothing else remains but Him. When that source begins to awaken, something strange happens. Everything else loses its luster. Superficial conversations no longer satisfy you as they once did. Plans that once excited you now leave a bitter taste. Even the achievements others applaud seem underwhelming, and you ask yourself, why don't I enjoy what used to fill me? It's not that your heart is damaged, it's that it's being re-educated. God is disconnecting one by one the wires that tied your joy to temporary things, to reconnect them to the eternal. That's why you feel this kind of internal blackout. It's not just weariness, it's not just routine. It's an invisible hand shifting the center of gravity of your soul. Before, everything revolved around what you felt. Now, God is making everything revolve around who He is. And that transition hurts because it involves dying to many things that gave you a false sense of life. Think of Israel in the desert. God brought them out of Egypt, but Egypt still lived within them. They had food, they had customs, they had a way of life. Suddenly, they find themselves in a place where none of that exists. There are no pots of meat they remembered with nostalgia, no familiar flavors, no sense of security. From a human perspective, it feels like a loss. Spiritually, it was a liberation. Deuteronomy 8:2-3 says that God led them down that path to humble them, test them, and teach them that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. That is exactly what is happening with you. God is bringing you out of your emotional Egypts, out of those things that gave you quick relief but didn't heal your root. And while your flesh cries out to return to the familiar, your spirit begins to sense that there is a new manna you haven't yet tasted, a kind of nourishment that isn't measured by intense emotions, but by a presence that sustains even when everything else loses its flavor. This new manna doesn't arrive with applause or explosive emotion. It arrives silently, like spiritual nourishment that appears when the old no longer works. The problem is that at first, the heart doesn't recognize it. Just as Israel looked at the manna and said, "What is this?" You too look at this stage and can't define it. You don't feel euphoria, you don't feel motivation, you don't feel the same pleasure as before. And yet, something deep within you knows that this emptiness is not the end, but the space where God is beginning to speak in a different way. The absence of sensations is not the absence of God. It is the exact moment when He is dismantling your dependence on the senses. That's why, even though you don't feel pleasure, you begin to perceive a different kind of stability, a kind of peace that doesn't vibrate strongly, but remains. A silent repose that doesn't come from what you see, but from what your spirit begins to recognize as real. This recognition doesn't happen overnight. First comes discomfort. That a feeling of wandering without a map, of living without the emotional spark that once propelled you. Then comes the questioning, am I growing cold? Have I lost something? Is God no longer speaking to me? And then, very slowly, a new certainty begins to emerge, as if God wants to teach you to distinguish between emotion and presence. Before, you confused movement with communion, intensity with maturity, sensations with faith. But here, where the external has lost its flavor, your spirit begins to feel something more solid than fleeting joy. It begins to feel God without the need for external stimuli. And when this understanding begins to form, you discover that what seemed like an emotional desert is actually the season where He is tuning your inner ear to hear Him without noise, without filters, without depending on the light. Because the most transformative voice always appears in the darkness that seemed endless. And it is precisely in that seemingly endless darkness that the most delicate part of the process begins, the moment when God teaches you to differentiate between what you feel and what you are, between what you perceive and what He has said. When you no longer have emotions to drive you, when there is no enthusiasm to motivate you, and when even prayer feels dry, your faith is laid bare, revealed in its purest form. Before, your relationship with God had emotional support. A song inspired you, a message moved you, an atmosphere made you feel close to heaven. But now those stimuli are no longer enough. And although that dryness makes you uncomfortable, it is there that true spiritual maturity begins. Because love that depends on feelings is not deep love, it is attachment. And God is freeing you from what seemed spiritual, but at its core was emotional. That His presence isn't confirmed by shivers, tears, or impulses, but by a certainty that pierces through discouragement like a rock in the midst of a storm. It is at this stage that John 14:27 truly comes to life, a peace that doesn't waver, that isn't dependent on the emotional climate, that isn't destroyed when your heart seems empty. A sober, mature, silent peace that doesn't impress, but sustains. And as that peace begins to take hold, you discover that even in the dryness, something within you keeps saying, "I don't feel the same as before, but I know He is here." That "I know He is here" is the first indication that something within you is realigning, even if you don't yet understand how. It's as if God has turned off all the emotional lights so you can learn to identify His presence through a completely different method. Not by feeling, but by conviction. And that conviction doesn't arise from an intense moment, but from a stillness that at first seems unbearable. Because when you no longer feel anything, your heart enters a kind of mourning, trying to understand why what once motivated you now seems distant. However, that mourning is the sign that your roots are seeking a deeper level of nourishment, one that doesn't depend on the superficial movement of your emotions, but on the eternal stability of the one who dwells in your spirit. What your soul calls loss, heaven calls transition. In this transition, God begins to reveal to you that many of the joys you once enjoyed were shadows, anticipations, reflections of something greater. They weren't bad, but they weren't enough to sustain you in the long run. That's why now, when you try to return to your old sources of joy, they no longer work. What once thrilled you now feels mechanical, forced, even empty. And that feeling isn't a punishment. It's a divine diagnosis. Your spirit has grown, and what once nourished it no longer has the capacity to satisfy it. It's like when a child stops being satisfied with liquid food because their body craves something more solid. Your soul is going through that same change. God is telling you, without words, you can't continue living on what once sustained you. There's something greater waiting for you. And as that something bigger approaches, what surrounds you seems to wear down, lose color, slowly fade away. Not because it is dead, but because your inner self is being drawn towards a joy that you do not yet know, but that begins to breathe within you like a living promise. That living promise that begins to breathe within you doesn't manifest immediately. It feels more like a silent calling, a gentle attraction inviting you to stop searching outside for what can only be born within. As the external world loses its color, the internal begins to germinate. It's a hidden growth, almost imperceptible yet steady. And although you don't yet experience joy, you do begin to notice that you're no longer so desperate about not feeling it. Something inside you is changing the way you interpret your own dryness. You no longer see it as an enemy, but as a teacher. It's teaching you what no season of intense emotions could. That true spiritual life doesn't depend on emotional peaks, but on a deep anchor that remains even when the surface is still. This is the point where your soul becomes more receptive, where God can form convictions that were previously impossible because your emotions were too volatile. And it is precisely in that silence, when you no longer fight against the aridity, that God begins to reveal something even deeper. You were more attached to the joy He gave you than to Himself. You were seeking peace, not the Prince of Peace. You were seeking comfort, not the Comforter. You were seeking spiritual encouragement, not the Spirit. Without realizing it, you had made your own feelings a small refuge where you leaned without noticing. But God loves you too much to let you build your faith on fleeting emotions. That is why He extinguished what once sustained you, not to hurt you, but to set you free, so that you might discover that true joy does not spring from circumstances, nor from emotional sparks, nor from spiritual atmosphere, but from a communion that cannot be measured by what you feel, but by what transforms you. And when this truth begins to dawn within you, you experience something unexpected, a gentle awakening, an inner vibration that is neither emotion nor absolute silence. It is like the first ray of light before dawn, announcing that what is to come will be unlike anything you have ever experienced before. That first ray of light that appears within you doesn't illuminate everything immediately, but it does reveal something essential. Your heart is being restored from a place deeper than the realm of emotions. It's not a return to old joy, but a preparation for a completely different kind of joy. More stable, purer, more connected to truth than to mere sensation. And as that ray moves forward, you begin to notice that your soul no longer seeks experiences to feel alive. Now it seeks meaning, presence, truth. The things you once pursued for a fleeting moment of relief no longer attract you, because your spirit recognizes that they were too small to contain what God is forming within you. It's as if your inner self understands, even before your mind, that you are being prepared to receive a kind of joy that doesn't depend on anything external, a joy that doesn't fade when the seasons change. But before that joy can manifest, God has to finish emptying what filled your inner spaces without truly giving you life. That's why, at this point in the process, many feel like they're losing all their sources of motivation at once. What once distracted them no longer does. What once excited them no longer does. What once sustained them no longer has the power. And although this loss feels uncomfortable, deep down, you know it's necessary. Because if God didn't remove the old supports, you would continue trying to build your stability on fragile emotions that shatter with the slightest breeze. Here, He is teaching you to live from the Spirit, not from the soul, from conviction, not from feeling. And as this understanding takes hold, you begin to perceive a new whisper, not of sadness, but of direction, as if the Spirit were beginning to guide you toward a place where joy is not a temporary visitor, but a permanent resident, even though you still can't clearly see that promised land that your inner self has already begun to sense. That promised land your inner self senses doesn't appear before your eyes as a clear landscape. It reveals itself first as a direction, a serene impulse born not of emotion, but of the Spirit. You begin to notice that while you don't feel joy, neither are you falling into despair. You are at an intermediate point that would have terrified you before, but which you now recognize as sacred ground. Here you no longer seek to feel something in order to believe. Now you believe even when you feel nothing. That is the greatest of spiritual advances, the moment when your faith no longer depends on the seasons of the soul, but on the unchanging nature of God. And at this point, the silence that once frightened you begins to feel like order. The absence of emotions that you once interpreted as coldness begins to feel like clarity. Something within you is aligning itself to a more eternal, slower, firmer, truer rhythm. And it is precisely there, while everything on the outside seems stagnant, that God begins to show you why nothing in the world fulfills you as it once did. It's not that everything has lost its value, it's that you are no longer the same person. You have been taken almost without realizing it to a spiritual level where earthly joys no longer reach your depths. You cannot return to the superficial because your spirit has grown too much. You cannot settle for the fleeting because your soul was designed for eternity. It is as if God has enlarged the size of your heart, and now nothing that is not of His dimension can satisfy it. That is why what once excited you no longer fits. What once distracted you no longer works. What once comforted you is no longer enough. It's not that you've lost the capacity to enjoy, it's that you're being prepared to enjoy something greater, something pure, something unchanging, something enduring. And as this truth takes root within you, a new kind of hunger arises. Not an emotional hunger, but a spiritual one, a silent yet profound longing that drives you to seek something you cannot yet see, but whose echo is already resonating in the deepest recesses of your soul. That deep echo that now resonates within you is not a mere longing. It is the sign that the Holy Spirit is creating space for a joy that is not dependent on circumstances, a joy born of truth and not emotion. This new kind of hunger does not drive you toward activities or stimuli, but toward a presence. You cannot explain it, but you feel that something within you is drawing toward God in a more mature, more sober, more real way. You no longer seek the old sparks of enthusiasm. Now you yearn for a spiritual stability that will not crumble with the first storm. And although this desire manifests itself in silence, its strength is greater than any fleeting emotion. It is the Spirit forming within you a faith that no longer flees from the desert, but traverses it with the certainty that God is not only at the end of the road, but within the road itself. As this longing grows, you begin to understand something that would have seemed impossible before. The lack of joy isn't a void, it's a shift. God is moving the center of your joy from earth to heaven, from the temporal to the eternal, from the emotional to the spiritual. That's why, even though on the outside it may seem that nothing pleases you, inside something begins to settle, to stabilize, to strengthen. It's as if God is rearranging your priorities without asking your permission, repositioning your heart toward that which can truly sustain it. And while this reorientation is happening, you also discover something else. Your spirit begins to rest, not because everything is clear, but because something within you recognizes that this work doesn't depend on your effort, but on the faithfulness of the one who promised to complete it. And it is in that silent rest that you realize that what seemed like emotional death is, in reality, a purification that prepares the ground for a joy that doesn't waver, doesn't flee, and doesn't fade. A joy you don't yet see, but that is already beginning to beat like an inevitable dawn. That inevitable dawn that begins to stir within you doesn't arrive with noise or fireworks. It arrives like light, filtering through a crack after a long night. At first timid, almost imperceptible, but constant. And as that light expands, understanding that it doesn't come from any external stimulus, your heart begins to experience something profoundly different. A joy that doesn't depend on feeling good, but on knowing in whom you stand firm. It's a joy that doesn't need your emotions' permission to exist. It doesn't fluctuate with your good days or disappear on your bad ones. It's a joy that is born as a fruit of the Spirit, not as a reaction of the soul. And when that kind of joy begins to sprout, even in small doses, you realize that nothing on earth can produce it, because it doesn't originate from you. It originates from God living within you. This joy doesn't come to replace your old emotions, but to govern them. It doesn't come as an impulse, but as a presence. It doesn't come to make you return to the superficial, but to help you recognize that you were created for something deeper than the pursuit of sensations. Now you understand, God didn't take away your capacity to enjoy. He is giving you back the capacity to enjoy properly, no longer from anxiety, but from peace. No longer from emptiness, but from fullness. No longer from need, but from rest. This is the point where your heart begins to remember, not with nostalgia, but with revelation. The joy of the Lord is not an intense emotion, it is a force. Nehemiah 8:10 declares it, but now you are experiencing it. You feel it as an unshakable foundation, as a pulse that sustains you, even when your soul still has dark days. And as this strength begins to take hold within you, something else becomes clear. What comes after this purification is not a return to the joy of before, but the birth of a joy that never fades, because it no longer depends on anything you could lose. And when that joy that cannot be extinguished begins to settle within you, you finally understand the purpose of this entire journey. It wasn't God turning away from you. It was God drawing you closer to Him. It wasn't loss. It was purification. It wasn't absence. It was transformation. Everything that ceased to bring you joy wasn't a punishment, but an act of love. God was cutting away superficial roots to plant eternal ones. He was breaking your dependence on the visible to teach you to live from the invisible. He was preparing your heart for a communion so deep, so stable, and so real that it could no longer be governed by the ups and downs of your soul. And now, looking back, you begin to understand that every silence was a call, every emptiness was an invitation, every dryness was fertile ground where he was sowing immortal joy. This joy that now breathes within you doesn't need intense emotions to be real. It doesn't depend on stimuli, seasons, or atmospheres. It's a joy that remains even when your body is weary, when your soul is still, when your emotions are subdued, because it no longer originates from you. It originates from the God who dwells within you, and that is the greatest miracle of this process. You discovered that eternal joy is not found when everything shines on the outside, but when everything is in order on the inside. You discovered that the desert did not kill your heart. It cleansed it. You discovered that silence didn't extinguish your faith. It deepened it. You discovered that the lack of taste didn't mean abandonment. It meant preparation. And now you understand the truth that God wanted to reveal to you from the beginning. When nothing in this world can fill you, it's because you are being called to the only source that never runs dry. This is how this journey ends, not with a return to the old you, but with the birth of the you God always intended to form, a you whose joy cannot be stolen, broken, or shattered, because it is sustained by the one who said, "My peace I leave with you, my peace I give you." And in embracing this revelation, you know that what God has awakened in your spirit is irreversible, because rising from the desert is not about going back to the way things were. It is about walking with a new heart, a mature faith, and a joy that now will truly last forever.